There's not much purpose in going down the list and enunciating them for you. I want at the beginning to thank those who have not been adequately mentioned, and that is all of you who are here, the translators, the analysts, the researchers, the librarians, and all of those who made it possible for the prosecution to receive the documentation that was necessary in order to obtain the convictions that were obtained. You'll recall that Professor Telford Taylor, who set the guiding lights, was determined that these subsequent proceedings would expand on what was only touched upon in the International Military Tribunal. In a brief trial of only a limited number of defendants, it was quite impossible to portray the entire panorama of German organization and German life, which made it possible to commit the greatest crimes that had ever been recorded in human history. And so the difficulty was, how do you decide who is to be tried? And how do you get the evidence? Because in order to obtain a conviction, you need two things. You need, first, evidence of crime beyond a reasonable doubt within the framework of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, to wit, aggression, crimes against humanity or war crimes, and you need the defendant in custody. If you have one and not the other, you cannot proceed. And in order to put these two components together, we required, it was necessary to obtain the cooperation of large numbers of all of you. The staff exceeded 1,000 people at one time in order to move forward on these 12 different trials, sometimes by chance, sometimes by plan in advance, which didn't turn out to be so good, as Walter Rockler pointed out to you. He was sent in, assigned to collect the evidence and prepare trials against the bankers, the Dresdner Bank and the Deutsche Bank. The Dresdner Bank and the Deutsche Bank have always been very prosperous. No one was ever convicted of bankers in that line, which has cast, sometimes he begins to doubt the utility of some of our exercises, and I can understand it. Fortunately, Henry has covered for us the military and SS trials. Bell dealt primarily with the I.G. Farben trial, which was a very important trial, and noted particularly that it was I.G. Farben that built the Auschwitz concentration camp. They planned it, they financed it for the purpose of using and abusing and working to death the slave laborers whom they employed in the Bonner plant. These facts were disclosed at I.G. Farben. We had other industrialist trials against Krupp. No one has mentioned the Krupp trial. We've been falsely accused of trying the son for the crimes of the father. Absolutely false. Krupp Jr. had taken over the management of the company. He should have been the one indicted and considered in the first trial. But he wasn't, and his father was senile. And so we proceeded to indict the man we should have indicted in the first place. We also had a trial against Flick. Flick got off fairly easy. But he, like the other industrialists, were part of the conspiracy to take human beings, and instead of just murdering them, as the Einsatzgruppen had done, where I was the chief prosecutor, but work them to death. It's much more efficient. We dealt with that in a book called Less Than Slaves. And they were less than slaves because a slave is someone whom you preserve and try to use. But as one of the survivors of Auschwitz described it, we were less than slaves. We were like a bit of sandpaper, rubbed a few times and then thrown away to be burned with the garbage. All of that is described in the book published by Harvard University, the introduction by Telford Taylor. The Germans made a television show out of it. They translated it into a book called Vernichtung durch Arbeit. The Japanese translated it. I can't give you the Japanese title, unfortunately, but it is being used in Japan by the comfort women who were abused by the Japanese. And they found in that book the moral principles and the legal principles stemming from Nuremberg, which they hoped would obtain compensation for them. And one thing which has not been mentioned is the survivors. What about the survivors? I stayed on in Germany for 10 years, 8 years after the Nuremberg Trials, in order to set up the restitution laws to compensate those who had survived. And it was a very complicated and difficult thing, too difficult to elaborate here. But as a result of that, the West German government, now the German government, will have spent over 100 billion marks in providing pensions for the survivors and some minimum compensation for those who survived Auschwitz. The amount they got was 5 marks a day, then the equivalent of $1 a day. Not much, but it was something, more than the industrialists did. Delbert Taylor criticized them in the introduction to the book, because the arguments they made, like the Japanese, were, if it hadn't been for us and providing work for them in our camps, they would have been destroyed immediately by the Einsatzgruppen or directly in the extermination factories. So we saved their lives. What do we owe them? They owe us. This was the type of argumentation made by serious, leading German industrialists, defended by such competent defense counsel as Dr. Kranzbühler, who today takes the airwaves and says the whole thing was a mistake. Time is about run out, so I bid you goodbye.